When the American soldiers entered Dachau concentration camp in April 1945, they found a camp where the prisoners were suffering and starving. Inside of Dachau, there was a reign of terror set up by the SS guards, and there was a huge amount of fear within the inmates. Executions were common, as was torture, and what the liberators found stuck with them for the rest of their lives. Dachau was considered the prototype camp set up by the Nazis, and also it was in operation from March 1933, right after Hitler seized control, up until the end of the Second World War. Over 188,000 people passed through the gates and were held against their will, and over 41,000 were killed because of the conditions, violence and executions conducted at the camp. But why were prisoners so fearful, and what did the guards do that caused a huge degree of terror? Join us today as we look at the brutal torture of the prisoners of Dachau, and remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Dachau acted as the prototype camp for the Third Reich, and many other concentration camps were based on it. Following the takeover of Bavaria on the 8th of March 1933, Heinrich Himmler began to speak to authorities about using a disused gunpowder and munitions factory to set up a camp for prisoners in protective custody. But the concentration camp at Dachau was created and opened on the 22nd of March 1933, and the first prisoners, around 200, came from Stadelheim prison and Landsberg prison. The camp initially could hold 5,000 prisoners, and it was considered the first concentration camp for political prisoners. Many people who were hated by the Germans were imprisoned there, and it was used to imprison the victims of the Nazi race laws. The construction was finished in mid-August 1938, and over 11,000 German and Austrian Jews were sent there following the Anschluss of Austria and the Sudetenland into the Nazi Empire. The Red Cross inspected Dachau twice and on both occasions noted the harsh treatment of prisoners. But following the camp opening, reports of deaths of prisoners were coming out at the hands of the SS. There was clear evidence of murder compiled against the SS commandant of Dachau, and also the camp doctor and the chief administrator. But the point of the prisoners there was that they were forced to work incredibly hard and would be exterminated through labour. They were forced to work in munitions factories and other industries, and Dachau was also used as a training camp for SS guards. The guards were schooled in hatred, and one speech given to the SS guards stated, "Comrades of the SS, you all know what the Führer has called us to do. We've not come here for human encounters with those pigs in there. We do not consider them human beings, as we are, but as second-class people. For years they've been able to continue their criminal existence, but now we are in power. If those pigs had come to power, they would have cut off all our heads. Therefore we have no room for sentimentalism. If anyone here cannot bear to see the blood of comrades, he does not belong, and had better leave. The more of these pig dogs we strike down, the fewer we need to feed." With this, it was clear what the intention was towards the prisoners and the victims. The camp was split into two areas, the main complex and also the crematorium. Inside the complex was 32 barracks. One of these was reserved for those who opposed the Nazis, and another was for prisoners who were used in medical experiments. All around the camp was an electrified barbed wire fence, where a number of prisoners took their lives as they could not live with the constant fear of death any longer. Executions were very common in the camp, and were conducted in the courtyard between the prison and the central kitchen. Here a gallows stood, and prisoners were regularly hanged and left for days dead to serve as a warning to other prisoners for breaking the camp's rules. These executions were conducted at roll call, where the whole of the inmates would be forced to watch. This was terrifying to see, and many witnessed their friends hanging. Also, there was another part of the camp which was used for executions. Following Operation Barbarossa, over 4,000 Soviet POWs were murdered by the guards of Dachau at an SS shooting range located 2 kilometers from Dachau's gates at Herbertshausen. These killings were a violation of the Geneva Convention, as prisoners of war should have been given some standard of care. But the SS gave these POWs special treatment as they referred to it, and they were shot dead at the shooting range, and the first killings took place on the 25th of November 1941. Many other people were executed on the range there, and thousands lost their lives. One other element of poor treatment and death at Dachau was that the guards were known for throwing the caps of prisoners into the 3-metre wide no man's land, and then when the prisoners entered this area, they were shot dead by the guards inside of the guard towers when they tried to retrieve their caps. Psychological torture was also common at Dachau, as were other methods used by the guards. One terrifying part of the punishment block was the Sterbunker, or the standing cells. These were tiny cells that were created so that a prisoner could do nothing but stand. They were so small that people could not sit down or crouch, and for days on end, 24 hours a day, they were forced into just one position. Some standing cells often held one prisoner, but some held up to 4, and there was only just a small opening for oxygen to come in and out. As the number of prisoners increased at Dachau in the final days of the war, the camp was overcrowded, and the SS created more standing cells. These were similar to chimneys and measured 75 centimetres by 80 centimetres, and there was a small hatch on top for air, and a narrow door with an iron bar, which was bolted to the cell. This drove prisoners to agony, and one former prisoner held inside the standing cell said, "It was a terrible state, as I thought it was over for me. Everything was so callous and distant for me. I could not lie down, could not crouch. The best was to stand 6 days and 6 nights long. You touch the wall on both sides with your elbows. Your back touches the wall behind you. Your knees the wall in front of you. This is no punishment for pre-trial detention. It is torture straightforward, Middle Ages torture. I had bloodshot eyes, numb from bad air. I was just waiting for the end." Another prisoner said how he was given just one single piece of bread in 3 days, and on the 4th they were allowed to be taken from the cell, and were given a meal, and allowed to sleep in a wooden cot, before the following day the confinement in the standing cell began all again. The SS sometimes did not interrupt on the 3rd day, and one man spent 8 days inside the cell straight. Prisoners were sometimes not allowed a break, and some had severe burns on them from their urine. Also, regular floggings and whippings took place. These took place in a public area. A stake was made and prisoners were tied to it, and then were whipped for infringing the camp's rules. If a prisoner miscounted the whips, then the whole process began again, and their screams could be heard all over Dachau. Another form of punishment and torture was pole hanging. This was where a prisoner was handcuffed behind their back, and then they were hung from a hook or a tree or a pole for a number of hours. This was common at Dachau, and there was a room that had a number of hooks on the walls for this purpose, and pole hanging was used in public, also to show other prisoners not to break the rules. Prisoners were often also forced to stand at roll call for hours on end, and were subject to group punishments if a member of the barrack had committed a crime. Several hundred prisoners were also tortured during ice water experiments, and many were left to die in freezing water. Some were pulled out, and then doctors experimented with how to revive them. One experiment using the water said, "There was one experiment that we most probably remember most vividly. It is so brutally cruel, and we could do nothing to help. 2 Russian officers were condemned to death. We don't know the reason. All objections were useless. Russia did not permit the use of an anaesthetic. The 2 were placed naked in cold water with a temperature of 3. In such cases, the anaesthetic effects of cold are usually felt after 2 hours. These 2 naturally tough individuals were in the water for 4 hours and had a temperature of 30. We approached Dr. Rasha once more to persuade him to permit an anaesthetic. The 2 men in the water evidently noted that we were speaking up for them, for one said to the other, 'Comrade, ask the officer to free us with a bullet.' The other replied, 'Don't hope for any mercy from that fascist dog.' They then shook hands and calmly said to one another, 'Farewell, comrade, we are not going to get out of this.'" As the final days of the Second World War were played out, in April 1945, prisoners were still being sent to Dachau. SS soldiers and police would confiscate food that locals would try to give the prisoners, and hundreds were dying on the transports to the camp. In one incident, around 300 bodies were taken from a train and were then dumped in a ravine near to the tracks, and then over 500 prisoners who were forced to carry the dead were then shot by the guards. Around 7,000 inmates were sent south from Dachau on a death march as the US Army approached, and any prisoner who could not keep up with the 6-day march was shot. Many died from hunger and exposure, and a mass grave of over 1,000 prisoners was found en route. At the time of liberation, 200 people at the camp were dying each day, and many were dying from typhus epidemics and also starvation, and the overcrowding did not help. Another thing to consider was that the evil and violence inflicted by the guards. Following the Second World War, many former members of staff at Dachau were executed for their evil, and many were accused of murdering prisoners who did not complete enough work. At the time of liberation, around 10,000 of the 30,000 prisoners were sick, and a number did die from their illnesses. As mentioned, over 40,000 people died at the camp from a number of different causes. Following liberation, a number of guards of Dachau were shot dead and executed in reprisals by the US Army forces, and a number were sentenced to death at war crimes trials. Dachau was a concentration camp which was used the longest by the Nazis. It grew to include a network of around 100 subcamps, and many of these served Dachau, and different businesses utilised the slave labour. It was a place where death was around every corner, and where the prisoners feared for their lives every day. They would wake up every day wondering if this day was their last, and many who passed through the barbed wire fences would never make it out alive. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.